There is something inherently comforting about a cabin in the woods, especially when the sky opens up and the rain starts to pour. You're inside, warm by the fire, separated from the cold, wet world by thick wooden walls. The sound of the rain is supposed to be relaxing. It drowns out the silence. But what happens when the rain becomes a veil? When the torrential downpour outside is so loud, it masks the sound of footsteps on your porch. When the storm is so severe, it means nobody can hear you scream, and no one can come to help you. Lie back, listen to the rain, and whatever you do, make sure your doors are locked. I rent a cabin in the Pacific Northwest once a year. I have a high-stress corporate job, and my therapist suggested taking 1 week every November to completely disconnect. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just books, a fireplace, and the woods. The cabin I chose 2 years ago was incredibly remote, sitting at the end of a 3-mile dirt road, surrounded by dense, towering pines. When I arrived, the sky was already the color of bruised iron. The weather forecast had warned of a massive storm system moving in, bringing heavy rain and potential flash floods. I didn't mind. I had enough firewood and groceries to last a week. By 8 p.m. the storm hit, and it was violent. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the cabin walls. The wind howled through the trees, making the old timber structure groan and settle. I was sitting on the couch, reading by the light of a single lamp, thoroughly enjoying the isolation. Then the power went out. It wasn't surprising given the storm. I lit a few candles I had placed around the room and went back to my book. But in the dim light, the cabin felt different. The windows which had shown the dark forest earlier were now just black, reflective mirrors. About an hour into the blackout, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost completely swallowed by the drumming of the rain on the metal roof. Click. Jiggle. I stopped reading. I held my breath, straining my ears. The storm roared on. I convinced myself it was just a branch hitting the side of the house. I lowered my head back to my book. Click, jiggle, squeak. That wasn't a branch. That was the sound of the heavy wooden shutters on the kitchen window being pried open, followed by the distinct sound of a hand testing the locked glass pane. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stood up slowly, making sure the floorboards didn't creak. I crept into the kitchen. It was pitch black. I didn't bring a candle with me. I pressed my back against the wall next to the window. The rain was deafening now. but because I was right next to the glass, I could hear what was happening outside. Someone was moving along the side of the cabin, their boots sloshed in the thick mud. They were moving systematically. They reached the next window, the bathroom. Click, jiggle. They were checking every single entry point, looking for an unlocked window under the cover of the storm. I panicked. I was miles away from anyone. My car was parked at the bottom of a mud-slicked hill. I likely couldn't drive up in this weather, and I had no cell service. I ran to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the largest chef's knife I could find. I tracked the muddy footsteps by sound. They moved from the bathroom, around the back of the cabin, and finally to the front porch. The wooden planks groaned under a heavy weight. I was standing in the living room, gripping the knife, staring at the front door. Suddenly a flash of lightning illuminated the outside world for a fraction of a second. In that split second, the light flooded through the small glass pane at the top of the front door. I saw a face pressed flat against the glass, peering inside. It was a man soaking wet, his hands cupped around his eyes to block the glare of my candles. He was looking right at me. The darkness returned instantly, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the floor. I didn't move. I stood in the dark, pointing the knife at the door for 5 straight hours, until the sun came up and the rain finally stopped. When I finally dared to open the door, the man was gone, but left behind on the porch, perfectly lined up in front of the doormat, was a coil of thick, muddy rope and a roll of duct tape. I packed my bags and hiked the 3 miles out in the mud. I never went back. My boyfriend Mark and I booked a cheap A-frame cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a long weekend. The pictures online were cozy, but when we arrived, the place felt unloved. It smelled heavily of damp earth and old dust, and the floorboards dipped strangely under our feet. But it was cheap, and we were on a tight budget. On our second night, a torrential downpour started, the kind of rain that creates a wall of white water outside the windows. We decided to make the best of it, cooking dinner and opening a bottle of wine. Around midnight, we went to bed. The bedroom was on the ground floor, toward the back of the cabin. The sound of the rain was incredibly loud, creating a constant, heavy, static noise. I was hovering right on the edge of sleep when Mark nudged me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. Over the sound of the rain, I heard a rhythmic thumping. It was muffled, heavy, and sounded like it was coming from inside the cabin. "It's probably just the wind, banging a loose board against the siding," I said, trying to pull the blankets up. "No," Mark said, his voice tense. "It's not coming from outside." He sat up and grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight. He swung his legs out of bed and walked slowly out of the bedroom into the main living area. I followed him, suddenly feeling very cold. The thumping had stopped. We stood in the center of the dark living room, sweeping the flashlight beam across the old furniture. Nothing was out of place. Then we heard it again, but this time it wasn't a thump. It was a scrape, like something heavy being dragged. And Mark was right. It wasn't outside. It was coming from directly beneath our feet. The cabin was built on a raised foundation, meaning there was a crawl space underneath. We stared at the wide plank floorboards. The scraping sound moved directly under the living room rug, slowly heading toward the bedroom we had just left. Someone is under the house, I mouthed to Mark, my stomach dropping. Mark motioned for me to stay put. He tiptoed to the front door, thinking we should just run to the car. But as he reached for the deadbolt, the scraping sound stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, the sound of rusted metal hinges groaning. Mark shined his flashlight toward the source of the noise. In the corner of the living room, half hidden behind an old armchair, was an air return grate set into the floor. It was large, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. As we watched, frozen in absolute terror, the heavy iron grate slowly began to lift upward. A hand, pale and filthy, emerged from the dark hole, gripping the edge of the floorboards. We didn't wait to see a face. The pure, primal panic took over. Mark grabbed my arm, yanked the front door open, and we sprinted out into the freezing, blinding rain. We didn't even grab the car keys. They were on the kitchen counter. We ran through the mud and the dark woods for nearly a mile, until we reached the main highway and flagged down a passing truck. When the local sheriff went to the cabin the next morning, they found the crawl space. It had been set up like a nest. There were stolen blankets, empty food cans from the cabin's pantry, and a collection of carving knives. The person had been living under the floorboards the entire time we were there, waiting for the storm to mask the sound of them coming up into the house. I am a freelance illustrator, and I often work odd hours. Last year I had a massive deadline looming, so I asked my aunt if I could use her hunting cabin in upstate New York to lock myself away and finish my work. She agreed, warning me that a late season snow and rain mix was expected. I arrived late in the afternoon. The cabin was beautiful, built from heavy logs with a small mudroom attached to the front entrance to keep the cold out. By the time I unpacked my car, the weather had turned vicious. Freezing rain pelted down, instantly turning the ground into a slick, icy sludge. I locked the front door, turned up the thermostat, and set up my drawing tablet at the dining table. I put my headphones on, playing classical music to drown out the aggressive sound of the storm hitting the glass. I worked straight through until about 2 a.m. My eyes were burning, so I took off my headphones to stretch and get a glass of water. The sudden silence in my ears was replaced by the roaring of the wind and rain outside. I walked into the kitchen, filled my glass, and turned around. From where I stood in the kitchen, I had a clear view of the hallway leading to the front door and the interior door that separated the house from the mudroom. My heart completely stopped. The door to the mudroom was wide open. I distinctly remembered closing and locking it. But that wasn't the worst part. Leading from the open mudroom door, straight down the hallway and disappearing around the corner into the dark guest bedroom, was a trail of wet, muddy boot prints. The mud was thick and fresh. Tiny puddles of water were still forming around the treads, slowly seeping into the hardwood floor. Someone had come inside recently, while I was sitting just 20 feet away with my headphones on. My mind raced. The freezing rain outside was so loud. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard the heavy boots walking down the hall. I stood in the kitchen, a glass of water trembling in my hand. The trail of footprints only went one way, into the guest room. There was no trail leading back out. Whoever had walked into the cabin was still inside. I couldn't run to the front door because the footprints crossed right in front of it. I slowly set the glass down on the counter. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have my phone. It was on the table next to my drawing tablet. I listened. The rain battered the roof. The wind screamed. But underneath it all, coming from the pitch-black guest bedroom at the end of the hall, I heard a very soft, wet sound. Someone coughing, trying desperately to keep it quiet. I didn't think. I acted on pure instinct. I turned around, unlatched the kitchen window, pushed out the screen, and threw myself out into the freezing rain. I landed hard in the icy mud. Scrambling to my feet, I didn't look back. I ran to my car, praying I had left it unlocked. I had. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and hid under the dashboard until dawn. The police arrived hours later, after I drove to a diner down the mountain. The cabin was empty, but in the guest bedroom, hidden inside the closet, they found a soaking wet sleeping bag, muddy clothes, and a flashlight. The intruder had slipped in to escape the storm, walking right past me while I worked. They never found the person, but I still have nightmares about what would have happened if I hadn't taken my headphones off exactly when I did. The rain can wash away a lot of things. It can wash away footprints. It can wash away scent. And as we've heard tonight, it can wash away the sounds of someone trying to get inside. Next time you find yourself safely indoors during a storm, listening to the comforting sound of the rain against the glass, take a moment to check the locks, because you never know what the storm has dragged to your doorstep. Stay safe out there. Good night.